curious how lunch favorites have evolved over the decades? It's a fair question. After all, the ingredients haven't changed much. Still, each decade in the 20th century had its own spin on midday meals. Let's analyze those twists, shall we? Perfection salad was actually made in the humble town of New Castle, Pennsylvania. It's a pretty interesting story, too. It begins with Mrs. John Eliot Cook, who had first invented the iconic recipe to win a contest. At the time, the popular one to win was always the Knox Gelatin Contest, which was a pretty annual occurrence. It was always the place to go to for recipes and ideas that were breaking the conventional mold of what food should look like. Being out of the box is really just the prelude here. The tip of the iceberg, you could say. This dish was built with the idea of showing off all the different things you could do with gelatin. See, by the 1900s, the popular consensus around gelatin was that it was a dish that just couldn't ever work in a savory context. Most people wouldn't bet 2 cents on any dish that tried to do so, and for a long while the idea was left pretty unexplored. Mrs. John Eliot Cook set out to change that completely. Perfection salad, which is a molded gelatin-based dish, actually makes use of a lot of different kinds of things. I mean, it's a little hard to get them all down, since recipes that are in circulation right now are pretty different from the original one that was cooked up by, well, Mrs. Cook, no pun intended. This salad was supposed to be made using green peppers, celery, pimientos, and olives, and it would most commonly be suspended in this tangy lemon and vinegar-flavored gelatin base. It was the very first time a recipe ever tried to switch it up and mix gelatin into the savory side of things. People were pretty concerned about this new concoction, and initially receptions were pretty cold towards it. That all changed when the salad actually managed to compete in the contest, eventually winning a calm little third place for itself. That's pretty much the best advertisement you could ever get for yourself. In pop terms, it would be like launching off your career after winning America's Got Talent. Perfection salad wouldn't really stop its domination there. It would go on to become a countrywide staple too. I'm talking holiday meals, church lunches, brunches, and community celebrations. Basically, this thing was everywhere. It was marketed as a refined salad that really had a lot of new things to offer, and it was a time when salads didn't have the best public image to begin with either. Plus, it was a chance for people who were domestic cooks to show off their skill. Ever felt like impressing your neighbors, in-laws, or just your partner with your fancy cooking skills? You could easily go for a perfect salad and flex on them all. Nowadays, it's pretty much an artifact, but back then, it was really something to marvel at. People were totally not used to such a synchronized mix between sweet and savory, and when they did get to try it, they were left pretty shocked. It basically opened a lot of new doors for what flavors could work together, and it did all that in the form of a salad. That's a pretty serious resume. So not every origin story is that clear-cut and dry. If you take a look at chop suey, for example, then it's actually got a lot of myths surrounding it. So, the name itself comes from tsop sui, which is a Cantonese phrase that literally translates to mixed pieces. Now, there are a couple of different ideas surrounding the inception of this. Some people think it was referring to a peasant mix of leftover vegetables that would be stir-fried, and it was typically made using leftover scraps of meat and soy sauce. Some others think that it was a southern Chinese classic, and some others still think that it was Chinese-American immigrants that first brought it over. One of the most iconic legends actually involves those same waves of immigrants. It suggests that in the 1860s in San Francisco, a Chinese chef originally made the dish for workers returning from a mining expedition. Apparently, they loved it so much that the dish stuck around fairly well. A lot of the academic debate on this leans towards this story being a hoax, though. Most likely bet is just that Cantonese people brought it over with them. Either way, take your pick as to how this started. The more interesting part is how it became a symbol of Chinatown and Chinese-American cuisine. A lot of the restaurants that were around back in the day with a focus on Chinese cuisine adapted chop suey because of how much of a hit it was with the broader population. It was mild, flavor-wise, nothing that would really step on your toes or be too out there in terms of what it was trying to do. It also looked really pretty, so you felt like you were eating this fancy foreign recipe that's pretty traditional and like a family secret passed down through generations. At least that's how people romanticized it. In reality, it was just a pretty palatable stir-fry that managed to catch a lot of people's eyes. It got its fair share of love in popular Chinese media too, and you'd always see advertisements for it whenever you'd cross any Chinatown. Plus, it was a part of Chinese culture that people could gawk at and also eat without worrying. What I mean by that is that it was financially accessible. I know you're probably thinking that's a lot of words to say. It was pretty cheap, but give me a little benefit of the doubt. I don't just mean cheap for the average income household back then. I mean affordable, like for everyone. It didn't matter what tax bracket you were in, you could definitely enjoy chop suey. Plus, it was this really steamy, hot dish that had a lot of natural flavors in it, so it became a sort of wintertime comfort food sensation as well. It definitely had a pretty strong grip on the 1910s, and though it's not as popular now as it was then, it's still a hallmark of Chinese-American flavors. So, what if you wanted to enjoy the finer side of things? Take it up a notch. Make dinner something fancy. Back in the 1920s, apparently, the best way to do that was to treat yourself to some shrimp in ramekins. Shrimp is something you sometimes associate with fine dining, but it's usually accompanied by something else or being backed up by a lot of side pieces to make it stand out. If you take a dive into French cuisine, though, you'll find out that they have a pretty different take on shrimp and some pretty extravagant methods of cooking it. As always with French dishes, the sauce is as much the star as the main ingredient, and in this case, the dish would always use Newburgh sauce, which was based off of classic French bechamel and velouté sauces. By the 1900s, pretty much all shrimp in ramekins were made using this specific format. These French cooking techniques were spread heavily throughout the 1920s by renowned chefs such as Escoffier, and they pretty much laid the roots for a lot of what we have nowadays too. It was actually dishes like chop suey that paved the way for this kind of exploration into foreign cuisines, interestingly enough. Anyway, that's a lot of backstory. Let's talk a bit about the thing itself. Typically, you can expect your shrimp in ramekins to look like sautéed shrimp in a pretty decadent and thick sauce, very heavy on the seasoning, by the way. Your typical ingredients would be stuff like sherry or paprika and egg yolks. You take that, some buttered ramekins and cheese and get it baking real good, and then you have yourself shrimp in ramekins. It was pretty much something you'd get in expensive French restaurants back in the 1920s, so it was like the perfect thing to get on a date or some kind of other memorable day. You could also just make an exciting little day out of trying multi-course meals and come across this since it was pretty common back then to serve it as an entree. Honestly, a lot of French dishes and cooking styles would make their mark later on, but if you really look back at the things that made it possible, it was dishes like this. Simple enough, but it was one of the best things to get throughout the entire decade, though it was a bit reserved for the upper class. That meant that it escaped a lot of the bigger crowd that would usually get their grub at more reasonable places, but it was never aiming to be that kind of dish anyway. It got a lot of spotlight in women's cookbooks and magazines too, especially those that would specifically be centered around party menus. Ever want to impress a guest at your next dinner party? Maybe you can try out this 1920s classic and impress everyone with a twist on shrimp they've never had before. I mean, if it worked for them, all the way back when it was pretty trendy and popular to serve this, it'll definitely work now that everyone's moved on from it and doesn't really remember. So, sloppy joes are actually such an interesting thing to talk about. Did you know how much history is behind this sandwich? It seems like a far-fetched idea since it's pretty much just a tomato sauce spread over bread with ground beef, but it really does have some pretty deep roots. So, the sloppy joe actually goes all the way back to 1930, and this was right after the stock market crash was fresh in everyone's minds. People were struggling to cope with the after effects, and as the shocks of the collapse rippled through America, they slowly started losing more and more of the things they once expected were normal parts of the day. Now, the need for easy, accessible, cheap, and nutritious food was becoming more and more of a priority for Americans. Naturally, they weren't working with a lot, so they had to put something on the table. Right before the sloppy joe, in around the 1920s, there was what you could call the prototype joe. This was basically known as a loose meat sandwich, and it involved ground meat sandwiched in between bread. The only thing that was missing? The iconic tomato sauce that a sloppy Joe is known for. These weren't ever served with sauces, but all the same, they were one of the most popular kinds of sandwiches to get. This was pretty much the inspiration for sloppy Joes, which fit every need Americans had surrounding their diet. They were easy, they were cheap, they were delicious for the cost and effort, and they took no time. On top of that, the government decided to make things even easier for once by really going all in on canned goods. The increased manufacture in the 30s and 40s meant that canned tomato goods like sauces and ketchup became incredibly popular. After that, it was only natural for sloppy Joes to take over as the new sandwich that would reign at the top of America's food scene. It was so much more than just a trend, though. It became a part of the culture. The sloppy Joe was the people's answer to a harsh time that had been thrown upon them out of literally nowhere. While people struggled to make ends meet and provide, they found some kind of comfort in knowing that they could at least make a Joe without worrying about food stocks or going out to buy meat the next day. I mean, it was more sauce than ground beef anyway. What it always will be is a great time and a classic reminder of how people got around the chaos that the Depression caused. I bet you didn't ever think a sloppy Joe could have that much of a backstory behind it, but hey, stranger things happen. It's actually a little heartwarming, don't you agree? Either way, I'm going to appreciate the next sloppy Joe just a little bit more. How do you make yours? Over the years, people have really found some variations and have started adding to the original meat, sauce, and bread recipe. If you have any interesting takes, don't gatekeep them. Drop them down in the comments below. I mean, look, far be it from me to hate on anyone or where they draw their culture from, but really, vichyssoise? There's probably no better example of a dish that works because of an exciting story behind it. So basically, Louis Diat first came up with this dish when he was experimenting with leek and potato soup and decided to try serving it cold for once. Revolutionary idea, I know, but it was uncommon enough, especially given the fact that this is a French dish. Vichyssoise had pretty much always been one of the most traditional kinds of soups you could get there, but once Diaz adapted it and spread his variant, that's the one that really took off. It was always seen as this super elegant dish that was also giving people a bit of comfort after the likes of World War II, which in itself inspired a lot of use of French culture. Vichyssoise was always associated with fine dining, and that high-scale appeal really helped its status in the long run. It got displayed by prominent chefs and by up-and-coming restaurants alike. See, another benefit of the war here was that people had become extremely used to having soups as a regular part of their diet. During the Depression and the war, that was pretty much how people were existing, and it was a time that people don't really look back on favorably. Which is why the parts that people can remember are things they cherish deeply. The idea of potato soup was extremely popular in the 1930s, and honestly, it only got more and more of a common thing after the war. The general crowd was starting to realize they loved things like soup, and vichyssoise was the fanciest one to try if you were really looking to get into this. It was one of the first times a chilled soup became the norm, but it came right in time too. See, the rise of refrigeration was pretty much in line with the time when vichyssoise was a common thing you'd see in American restaurants. Now, I don't need to tell you that a fridge and chilled soup go together like bread and butter. It was really just good timing, circumstances, and also a pretty reliable recipe for soup that made this dish the decade-long success story that it was. I don't think Louis Diat ever expected his chilled variant to take off this much, but now that it has, vichyssoise is a cherished part of American history. So this time, our influences lie right in the heart of European and British culture. Coronation chicken was actually something people made for the first time in 1953 to celebrate Queen Elizabeth II and her, well, coronation. This was a cold curried chicken salad that was pretty much very similar to what we just discussed, but was still a little new. It was created specifically by Constance Spry for the coronation, and she was a very renowned chef. Alongside Rosemary Hume, both were credited with making this fine dish. It was actually supposed to have been inspired by Jubilee chicken, which was another chicken salad that had been made for a previous king. Still, coronation chicken was a little special in how it was built. While it was clearly made to appeal to the European palate, it was also designed to be very compatible with international tastes too. That was probably influenced by the effect of globalization, but I'm glad they made it that way. The original recipe for Coronation chicken was pretty simple. It just had poached chicken and a curry-based sauce that had been loaded with aromatics. The sauce really emphasized using apricot puree or dried apricots, and that gave the dish both a savory and a sweet direction. Though America was still pretty much in full-time recovery, Coronation chicken was steadily on its way to becoming one of the most prominent salads of the century. The chicken aspect is what really made it click with people here. While people were definitely used to already having bits of meat in their salads to make them exciting, see, a lot of them weren't used to the way Coronation chicken used aromatics. The chicken was so blatantly driven by the flavors of the curry-like sauce, which really was a new treat for lots of Americans. Then, it was also pretty accessible. It was really easy to make Coronation chicken, even at home. You could pretty much get it going for any kind of event, a party, a picnic, or just a healthier day focused on greener eating. People definitely have applied their own spins on this dish and taken it in new directions, but Coronation chicken is still pretty much a big symbol of the impact European, and in specific, British cooking has left on America. It was also really easy to make this in post-World War America, where the economy still hadn't fully settled. A lot of people were still really trying to keep their pantries full and had ingredients missing for typical American meals like casseroles and meatloaves. They made do with a lot of Depression-era food, but this salad was easy and cheap enough to make. That definitely did help it gain more steam. To be honest, it was also a big part of the overall trend of people going for lighter, more refreshing vegetable-based meals, although that hadn't completely begun in America, not just yet. Coq au vin is another classic French dish that has some pretty exotic little twists and turns. It involves a lot of braising and a lot of chicken, mushrooms, onions, and bacon. Already, we're off to an extremely compatible start. All those things see no shortage of love in America, after all. Funnily enough, as fancy as this sounds, it's actually a complete peasant classic from the French. It was made by lower-class households in France using bare-bones ingredients, and the braising was a way to add to the flavor. It actually got so popular in America thanks to two things. One, there was this growing natural interest in foreign cuisines, especially French cooking. This was just universal and was something you could observe in any area of America. Two, it was thanks to the constant efforts of Julia Child making French recipes popular on television, in cookbooks, magazines, and just about wherever else you saw her. So you had a public with a curiosity about French cooking and a French chef that specializes in the cuisine. Truly, where would we go from here? Coq au vin was an obvious choice that was going to touch American soil eventually, and I'm just glad it did it in recent memory. Did you ever wonder where this obsession with French cooking came from? Well, for one reason, we had just dabbled in lots of French dishes before and had some pretty positive experiences. There was a national trust around the cuisine, and most people thought of it as one to really take notes from. Two, there were so many soldiers who were returning to America for the first time from Europe since the war. Naturally, they had been pretty well introduced to French and European cooking by that time and brought back those flavors with them. Julia Child also helped a lot, as I previously mentioned. Her book, literally known as Mastering the Art of French Cooking, was the first starting point for the American public when it came to getting familiar with French cuisine. It was accessible, simple enough, and coq au vin was one of the best recipes to try from it. Julia also demonstrated how to make a coq au vin on the French chef, and she spent a lot of her career making these recipes a lot easier to access and learn for people. It was thanks to that people felt confident enough to try it in their homes. Think of it like a very prototype version of wanting to cook something and watching the recipe on YouTube. Typically, French people would use decently sized adult roosters for the coq au vin, which is why it ever needed to be braised in the first place. In America, they use more tender chickens, but the braising is still a key aspect. It was considered a high-quality fine dining meal that came at a price, but was worth the experience. Plus, it also became a bit of a point of competition. Lots of chefs would compete over who could do it better, and that was just good for business. General Tso's chicken is actually a pretty nice thing to visit if you want to get into more of what Chinese-American cooking used to be like. So, despite how little it was displayed in its early years, it actually is a pretty strong element of Chinese-American culture. The dish itself was named after a very renowned war general, Zhuo Zongtang, who was a Qing dynasty figure prominent around the Hunan province. He was also known as General Tso. At least, that's the only reference people can find for the name. The dish itself was arguably made by Peng Changkui, who was a chef that came from that very same province. Peng pretty much single-handedly made the recipe during his time as a banquet chef, and after China doubled down on communism, he fled to Taiwan. Apparently, that's where he first made the dish before he brought it on over to New York City around the 1970s. The dish itself takes a lot out of that region, though, since it's known mostly for its extreme uses of spices. Of course, eventually the recipe trickled down to American restaurants and lost a lot of that kick. Traditional Hunan Tso's chicken also didn't ever have any kind of sauce or any deep frying, so that was definitely something people in America made to make it more compatible with the taste buds that people were familiar with. The 1970s in particular had an extreme emphasis on Chinese-American dining. There were all kinds of new restaurants opening up, and they were bringing in even more elements of Chinese culture that people hadn't seen before. American palates were pretty stuck in stone, though, and it was hard to get around them. That's why they introduced deep frying it with crispy fried chicken and a sweet sauce. It made the dish pretty crunchy and gave it a nice little look. The best part was that it used boneless thigh meat, so it was never an outrageously expensive dish. That allowed Chinese and purely American people alike to enjoy this new version of a Chinese classic. You know, one thing we've barely talked about so far is Cajun cuisine, and a good way to start that conversation is to see what blackened redfish was like. This one is something we can thank Paul Prudhomme for, who was a pretty notable chef out of Louisiana. Cajun cuisine was heavily influenced by French settlers who had made their place in Louisiana since the 18th century. So that area always had a strong emphasis on French cooking. However, it's something that has diluted and changed shape over time. See, that kind of cooking never really involved a big focus on spices, and it definitely wasn't made in cast iron skillets. Both of these things were aspects that Prudhomme pretty much went all in on when he was making blackened redfish. It was in his New Orleans restaurant, affectionately known as K. Paul's Louisiana Kitchen, where he first served the dish. His idea here was to make this really explosive, vibrant dish that had a lot of Louisiana's typical flavors. The area was known for its well-documented and massive love of seafood and spices, and both of those were aspects that Prudhomme wanted to really put as the centerpieces. Plus, Paul would do something different. He would coat the red fish fillet in this butter and spice mix and then sear it for a decent bit in a very hot cast iron skillet, and that's how he got the blackened part of the name. The heat was hot enough to pretty much instantaneously caramelize the pieces and better, but it wouldn't mess with the moisture of the dish either, so it was like this perfect sweet spot. Like I mentioned just a while ago, Louisiana is a place exclusively known for how much seafood it consumes. The fishing industry is a well-oiled machine there, and redfish was one of the most common kinds of species available in the Gulf. This was a common fish and was a part of the local community's diet anyway, so when Paul Prudhomme took a gamble and worked on a much more flavorful spin on it, people immediately flocked to it. It was dramatic, it had flair, it was new, and at the same time, it was all too familiar. One of Prudhomme's cookbooks, Louisiana Kitchen, was also showcasing the recipe at the forefront, and it became a pretty memorable part of Cajun cooking. You might be wondering, if it's so good, why don't we hear about it anymore? Actually, this is a pretty dark side of seafood dishes that get popular. It led to a lot of overfishing of redfish, enough that the federal government had to intervene because populations were declining really badly. Other substitutes like catfish and salmon were used instead, though they weren't as popular. So, pepper-crusted tuna was actually something that took a lot of inspiration from Japanese cooking. I know that's one we don't hear about too often besides chicken katsu curries and ramen bowls, but it is a pretty good one to take inspo from. In particular, there's this one Japanese dish I want to reference, which I'm pretty sure is the inspiration for pepper-crusted tuna. This is known as tataki, and it involves a pretty light and generous sear over some real high heat, and then the fish is served raw on the inside. Don't look at me. These are the same people that came up with sushi. The minimalist preparation really does match up well with Japanese cooking, though. Of course, there weren't any kinds of things like peppercorns serving as a crust or lots of spices and herbs. The pepper crusting aspect was entirely Western, but it does bring me to an interesting topic. See, the thing here is that in the 1980s and 1990s, people apparently really started to get into fusion food. I think the seeds for it had been sown a long while ago thanks to all the mock food that was coming out in the war, which was showing people all kinds of new flavors with ingredients they had never given a second glance to. Plus, it helped that sushi was also already growing steadily. People were realizing they had a bit more room to play with when it came to serving raw fish, thanks to that. Pepper-crusted tuna was left raw on the inside, but the crust was really something to behold. It made the dish so much more flavorful than it originally was. Don't get me wrong, some people definitely had their issues with it, mostly traditionalists who thought that Americans were disrespecting the dish, but overall, a lot of people responded pretty positively to the recipe. Also, do you remember how I said that America hasn't really developed its habit of greener, leaner eating? Well, by the 1990s, that was in full swing. See, before this, the past decades were marked by an explosion in fast food and convenience culture, which basically meant that people were eating worse than ever before. There was a nationwide sentiment growing mostly from concerned parents about returning to more organic and natural food. Tuna, being a lean protein that's loaded with omega-3 fatty acids, fit like a glove. It was visually pretty appealing. You had the crimson red of the tuna with the dark, smoky pepper crust. It also tasted extremely good, and it was healthy. Tuna wasn't exactly a 5-star protein, so it wasn't too expensive to get, unlike sushi, which was sometimes out of the price range of people. All in all, this dish did most things right. It had style, it was accessible, and it was new while still being familiar enough. Since the theme is genre and decade-defining dishes, what better place to end it on than macaroni and cheese? Seriously, it's hard to do this dish credit. I mean, when else in recent memory have we gotten something that ticks all the boxes and does it so well? All the dishes up here are definitely knockouts in their own right, and they had a grip on their respective decades like nothing else during the time. But this is just something else. Mac and cheese goes all the way back to the medieval ages too, you know? It's not something that just came out of the 2000s. The earliest recipe you could find involved pasta sheets being layered with cheese and butter, kind of like a lasagna. There are global references in almost every culture to some variant of mac and cheese, but in America, it was Thomas Jefferson who we can thank for bringing it over. He was an ambassador to France during the 19th century, and he actually fell head over heels in love with all the different kinds of pasta dishes he found there. This man was properly committed to the bit. He even ordered a pasta machine, and apparently it was out of that machine that Americans first got macaroni and cheese. The next time you'd see this in the mainstream conversation would be Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife, which was an 1824 cookbook that pretty much emphasized baking macaroni with cheese and butter. These two were the blueprints upon which all mac and cheese in the 2000s was built. There were lots of factors that helped macaroni achieve its spotlight. By the 2000s, pasta manufacturing technology was doing pretty well for itself. It meant that middle-class families could pretty comfortably afford pasta, and very regularly too. Then, there were all kinds of community cookbooks that were really pushing mac and cheese as a homemade staple. Stuffies are quite a unique lunch served up in Rhode Island. Served in clamshells, the dish is made of chopped clams mixed with several spices and bread, then it is baked. While Rhode Island has several seafood dishes available, stuffies were easy to eat and were a quick snack for those on a tight schedule, making them a popular lunch food. Found in the Charleston Recipes cookbook in the 1950s, shrimp and grits emerged as a popular lunch in South Carolina. The creamy shrimp and grits recipe embedded in one of the pages would become the most popular breakfast and lunch food in households across South Carolina. In 1976, shrimp and grits was even declared as South Carolina's official state food. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Fried chicken patties were introduced to American schools in the 1980s and quickly became a favorite due to their similarity to popular fast food. These patties are made from ground chicken mixed with spices, then breaded with flour and breadcrumbs to create a crispy outer layer. The frying process transforms these prepared patties into golden, crunchy delights with a juicy interior, typically served as sandwiches or with sides like fries. The method of preparing these patties is well suited to the high-volume requirements of school cafeterias, involving simple steps that can be executed quickly: mixing, forming, breading, and frying. This efficiency ensures that delicious hot meals can be served promptly, reducing wait times and maximizing student satisfaction during lunch breaks. It seemed that soups were quite a crowd favorite in the 1970s, as clam chowder was another iconic lunch served up in Massachusetts. Imagine enjoying a hot, creamy bowl of soup made with fresh clams, potatoes, onions, and a side of oyster crackers during your lunch break. Soups were not the only lunches rising in ranks across the states, as Michigan's Coney dog was one of the most iconic lunches in America. Nicknamed Coney dog, this hot dog was a beef frankfurter, wrapped in a steamed bun and topped with savory beef chili, mustard, and onions. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else, but Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking, because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents. Another cheap lunch item on this list is the Louisiana po' boy sandwich. Po, short for poor boy, was a sandwich typically filled with fried shrimp, oysters, or roast beef, and was served on French bread. Speaking of seafood, how could we forget the iconic lobster rolls from Maine? Fresh lobster meat served on a split top roll with a light butter and parsley dressing was a dream lunch for people in Maine. This heavenly creation was a fan favorite in Maine, where the cheapest seafood options before lobster roll was tinned fish. Boiled hot dogs have been a long-standing favorite in American school cafeterias, known for their simple, tasty, and quick preparation. Made from a blend of beef and pork, these hot dogs are seasoned and boiled, served in a soft bun with a variety of condiments like ketchup, mustard, and relish. This cooking method is particularly effective in school environments as it allows for hot dogs to be prepared en masse and kept warm. The simplicity of boiled hot dogs makes them a reliable choice for school cafeterias, where the lunch period is often brief and the demand for quick service is high. Additionally, the familiarity and ease of customization of hot dogs meet diverse student preferences, making them a popular and comforting choice. This meal option not only satisfies hunger swiftly, but also aligns with the logistical needs of serving hundreds of students. During lunchtimes in North Dakota, making knoofle soup was common in the 70s. Dakota had excess wheat production during this year, and the best way to use the flour was to create a creamy soup with dumplings and potatoes. It helped that knoofle soup was the perfect remedy for North Dakota's freezing temperatures, so every household was serving this perfectly balanced soup as a lunch meal. Parents baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You cannot mention Pennsylvania without the Philly cheesesteak. Thinly sliced steak with cheese on a hoagie roll was the invention of brothers Pat and Harry Oliveri. By the 70s, the Philly cheesesteak sandwich was the go-to order for every person looking for a filling lunch. Found at just about any deli, the sandwich was an invention Pennsylvania is proud of. Salisbury steak was incorporated into school menus in the 1960s, providing a hearty and appealing option. Named after Dr. James H. Salisbury, who advocated a meat-centric diet, it features ground beef mixed with eggs, breadcrumbs, and spices, shaped into patties and simmered in gravy. This method of preparation allows for bulk cooking, ideal for school settings where efficiency and volume are necessary. Salisbury steak offers significant nutritional value with its high protein content, making it a satisfying meal that supports the physical needs of growing students. The gravy not only adds flavor, but also keeps the patties moist and appealing throughout the serving period. Its rich flavor and tender texture have made it a favorite among students, ensuring it remains a popular choice in school cafeterias. Talking about budget lunches, the Cobb salad from California was a popular dish amongst people in search of a healthy salad. Cobb salad originated from the Brown Derby restaurant in Los Angeles after the chef realized he had not eaten in a while. Throwing together random ingredients, he created a salad that everyone would eat after a long day. It seems eggs were pretty popular in the 70s, as Colorado's Denver omelet is next on our list. An omelet filled with diced ham, onions, bell peppers, and cheese was originally served on bread as a sandwich in Western America. Somewhat inspired by the egg foo young, the Denver omelet eventually developed into a breadless, only egg dish that was thoroughly enjoyed in Colorado as a lunch meal. Where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners, they became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created. Massachusetts was not the only state chowing down on hearty chowder, as New Hampshire was also consuming this iconic soup in the 70s. Recipe-wise, the chowder in Hampshire was different as they used more fish than clams in their soup. Taylor ham sandwich in New Jersey was another iconic sandwich that people loved eating during their lunch hour. Invented by Senator John Taylor in Hamilton Square, the sandwich truly found popularity in the 1970s when restaurants put this Taylor ham, egg, and cheese sandwich on their menus. Tater tots were born out of innovation in 1953 by the founders of Ida Golden and Francis Neefy Grigg. Utilizing leftover potato scraps from their French fry production, they created a new snack by chopping these remnants finely, mixing them with flour and seasonings, and forming them into small cylinders before deep frying them to a golden crisp. This process not only provided an efficient solution to food waste, but also produced a snack that was perfectly crispy on the outside while remaining fluffy inside. Tater tots are particularly popular as a side dish, but can also feature in recipes like casseroles, making them a versatile component of school lunches. The method of preparing tater tots involves deep frying, which, while requiring careful temperature control to achieve the perfect crunch without burning, fits well within the capabilities of large kitchen operations in schools. Not much is known about the Arizona cheese crisp, besides the fact that cheese crisps are beloved appetizers served during lunchtime. A rather peculiar dish made out of an open-faced flour tortilla that is covered in shredded cheese was extremely popular amongst Mexican restaurants in Arizona. Unlike cheese crisps, the chicken and dumpling soup from Arkansas is a healthier and filling meal that was popularized in the 1970s. A soup created from cooking chicken in water and using the remaining broth to boil dumplings emerged as the new comfort food for people across Arkansas. Sloppy Joes have been a staple in American school cafeterias since their introduction in the mid-20th century. This dish features ground beef or pork that is sautéed with onions and garlic until browned, then simmered in a savory tomato-based sauce seasoned with Worcestershire sauce and other spices. The thick, hearty mixture is then spooned onto soft hamburger buns, creating a filling and flavorful sandwich that is both messy and delightful to eat. The preparation requires minimal kitchen equipment and ingredients that are staples in most school pantries, making it a cost-effective choice for feeding a large number of students. Moreover, the ability to prepare the meat mixture ahead of time and quickly assemble the sandwiches during busy lunch periods enhances its practicality. The familiarity of the flavors, combined with the satisfying nature of the sandwich, ensures that Sloppy Joes remain a cherished option within school meal programs. Nevada's casinos created the iconic 50-cent shrimp cocktail that attracted heaps of people in 1970. Everything from affordability to taste drew people from all over the country to visit Nevada for its simple and unique shrimp cocktail. The shrimp cocktail was also one of the first seafood lunch items in Nevada, thus why it gained popularity. Eat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it, North Carolina loves pork more than deli meats, so it's no surprise that the local pulled pork BBQ sandwich was a lunch staple here. As BBQ restaurants started gaining popularity in the 70s, North Carolina's slow-cooked, spicy, and vinegary pulled pork sandwich was one of the most iconic ways to eat pork. Locals would pair shredded pork with barbecue sauce and put it between 2 slices of bread, and lunch would be served. Fish sticks became part of the school lunch menu shortly after their commercial introduction in the 1950s. Made from white fish like cod or pollock, these sticks are cut into manageable pieces, breaded and then deep-fried or baked to create a crispy exterior with a tender and flaky interior. This preparation method not only makes fish sticks easy to eat, but also appealing to the palates of young students who may otherwise be reluctant to consume fish. The breading, often seasoned with spices and herbs, adds a savory flavor that complements the mild taste of the fish, making it a popular choice in school cafeterias. Fish sticks are typically served with tartar sauce or ketchup and a side of vegetables, providing a balanced meal with proteins, carbs, and vitamins. Their ease of preparation, including the ability to cook them from frozen, aligns well with the needs of large-scale meal production typical in schools. Indiana took fancy to another level with their breaded pork tenderloin sandwich. Basically, the sandwich was a large piece of pork tenderloin that was breaded, then fried, and served up on a bun. Created by a restaurateur named Nick Feinstein, he took the idea of veal sandwiches and replaced it with pork. The sandwich found great success in Indiana, achieving legendary status in the state. Was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century. Macaroni and cheese loaf emerged as a popular variation in the 1970s when schools sought to diversify their menu offerings while still providing comforting and familiar foods. This dish takes the beloved elements of traditional macaroni and cheese, a mixture of cooked macaroni and creamy cheese sauce, and adds eggs and breadcrumbs to bind the ingredients into a solid loaf that can be easily sliced. The loaf is baked until the exterior is slightly crispy and golden, offering a textural contrast to the soft, cheesy interior. This format not only makes serving more efficient, but also reduces food waste, as the loaf can be cut into precise portions. The catfish po' boy was lesser known across America and more of a Mississippi special. A true working-class lunch, the catfish po' boy sandwich was born during a strike when workers were protesting for rights. During this time, local restaurant owners Benny and Clovis Martin gave out free sandwiches made with fried catfish, lettuce, tomato, and remoulade sauce. Since then, these sandwiches were sold at a cheap price during lunch breaks. Cheese balls. These were the perfect bite-sized appetizer to gorge yourself on while you waited for the main meal. A lot of grandmas would have handwritten notes tacked onto family cookbooks about how to make the perfect ham ball, what the ratio of meat was, how much cheese you needed to put in, how much you needed to roll them and shape them before they were perfect. It was one of those snacks that just did well everywhere. In Iowa, too, it was one of the most easily available snacks you could find anywhere in the state. All in all, it's one of the best things to ever come out of the Midwest. And no Christmas is honestly complete until you down a platter of ham cheese balls and make the tray look spotless. Have you ever grown up around these? Do you still remember the taste? It's not something you would find so often nowadays, but the days when it was really everywhere were some good ones. Bread pudding offers a creative solution for utilizing leftover bread in school cafeterias, turning potential waste into a delectable dessert. This dish is typically prepared by cubing stale bread and soaking it in a mixture made from milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, which infuses it with rich flavors and a soft texture. Often, additions like raisins or cinnamon are mixed in to enhance the taste and appeal of the pudding. Bread pudding is then baked until the top layer caramelizes into a golden crust, contrasting beautifully with the creamy custard-like interior. This dessert is particularly popular in schools due to its economical benefits and the comfort it provides to students. The warm, sweet nature of bread pudding makes it a welcomed treat, encouraging students to partake in school meals while providing them with a source of energy. The chicken fried steak lunch was once the favorite dish of Oklahoma. This thinly pounded chicken that is breaded and fried was served with gravy to chicken fried steak enthusiasts across Oklahoma. Mostly popular during lunch hours, this dish was always on the specials menu. Restaurants in Oklahoma would make it a point to list this dish down as a steak, not fried chicken. Soon enough, this dish was strong competition to regular beef steaks. Hoppin' John's soup, which is right out of the classics of soul food in the southern parts of America and all over, really. I say the South because that's where people most commonly associate its origins with. However, the Hoppin' John dish itself was something that was a result of all the Africans that were brought over as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. This dish typically involves black-eyed peas and African rice, but in soup form, it works just as well with mushrooms, basic vegetables like bell peppers, and spices. This is one of the best soups you could find yourself making in the winter, especially if you live in areas where the temperature really drops to bone-chilling levels. It's so hearty and warm that the dish just screams pure comfort in every way and form. It was a really popular appetizer on a lot of restaurant menus, and it was amazing as a lunch too, but this is a textbook example of an old head recipe. You wouldn't remember it, and your parents probably don't either if they're a little on the young side, but I'm sure anyone's grandparents would remember having this, or at least hearing about it in the days when it was still one of the trendiest soups around. If you take a look at the history of Brooklyn, you'll find something that was really popular, which was ham. Fresh Dungeness crabs served on toasted bread was Oregon's top pick when it came to unique lunches in the 70s. There was an ongoing debate in Oregon about the best way to eat Dungeness crab meat. Then came the crab sandwich, served on bread or a roll, which won people's hearts. It was not long before this sandwich was renowned statewide. Creamed corn is prepared by cooking sweet corn kernels until tender and then mixing them with a creamy sauce made from milk, butter, and a thickener such as flour or cornstarch. Seasoned lightly, usually with salt and pepper, and sometimes enhanced with sugar to bring out the natural sweetness of the corn, creamed corn is a favorite in school cafeterias for its smooth, slightly sweet flavor profile that appeals to young eaters. This dish serves as an excellent way to incorporate vegetables into students' diets in a form that is generally more palatable to children who may be picky eaters. Its popularity in schools is reinforced by its nutritional content, offering a good source of fiber and vitamins while being gentle on young stomachs. Creamed corn's ability to be kept warm in serving trays without losing texture or flavor makes it particularly suited to the cafeteria setting, where dishes need to remain appealing throughout the serving period. Cincinnati chili was the most interesting lunch item Ohio had to offer. Chili served over spaghetti and topped with cheese, onions, and beans was the new way to eat spaghetti. Cincinnati chili only ever gained popularity in Ohio, unable to find fans in other states, but it still remains an iconic creation because of the unique flavors the dish offered. For Nutter sandwiches, it really did stay mostly as a niche, but a pretty good one. This takes your typical bread, nothing really special, and your typical peanut butter, again, nothing you haven't seen around the block 1,000 times, and adds a bit of a twist. You ever think about what peanut butter could be stacked on top of some thick marshmallow creme? Me neither, until I was searching about the history of this dish and how they were a Massachusetts classic. Known as Liberty sandwiches and made by Emma Curtis in 1918, it was described as the perfect wholesome snack to get you a sugar rush whenever you needed it. Also, it was stupidly popular with children, especially around campfires. The stage for this dish goes all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, in 1970. The part of Ohio I'm specifically talking about is South Euclid, and the company I want to tell you about. Creamed spinach in school cafeterias combines nutritional value with palatable presentation, making it a favored vegetable dish among students. The preparation starts with fresh or frozen spinach, which is thoroughly washed and then cooked down until it wilts. A creamy sauce made from a blend of milk, flour, and butter is prepared separately, seasoned with a hint of nutmeg or garlic to enrich the flavor profile. The spinach is then incorporated into the sauce, which gently coats the leaves, creating a smooth and appealing texture. This dish not only adds a vibrant color to the plate, but also increases the intake of greens in students' diets, providing essential nutrients like iron, vitamin A, and calcium. The combination of creamy texture and mild flavors often helps to introduce and encourage a preference for vegetables among younger children, supporting school nutrition programs in their goal to foster healthier eating habits. Fried chicken is not the only iconic food Kentucky is known for, as the hot brown also originates from Kentucky. Originally created by Fred Schmidt, a chef at Brown Hotel in Louisville, the hot brown is an open-faced turkey sandwich topped with bacon, tomatoes, and Mornay sauce. First off, we have chicken and collard greens pilau, which is just the perfect dish to have if you're aching for something that involves a lot of rice in it. The steamed and boiled chicken mixed with the pilau as a base for the dish gives it an aroma that's pretty much unbeatable. Back in the middle of the 20th century, if you really wanted to experiment with some foreign cooking and tastes, then you would go into African American communities and try out the best of their soul food. You'd have to look around a little for the really nice restaurants, especially if you were in places like the southern parts of America, but nonetheless, people found a way. Pilau itself is also a dish that's extremely common in the subcontinent for many reasons. People use basmati rice for this, which is a little different from the rice you guys might be used to, but if you give it a shot, you might find that it has a more full flavor all around. Also, don't even get me started on how good this is for you. If you're a gym bro looking for a great way to add some tasty protein and carbs to your diet, then chicken and collard greens with some pilau is a pretty flawless place to start. The next thing we have on the list is, stepping aside from sandwiches, states like Hawaii preferred heartier meals like a plate lunch. Plate lunches were typically a meal consisting of rice, macaroni salad, and a meat entree. Customers would get several meat options like teriyaki chicken or kalua pork. It was somewhat akin to modern-day Chinese takeout, but localized for Hawaii. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. So the next two dishes we have on the list are actually some classics right out of Africa and its many varied cuisines. First, rice pudding is a classic dessert that finds its way into school menus, beloved for its simplicity and comforting qualities. Made by slowly simmering rice in milk until the grains are tender, this pudding is sweetened with sugar and typically flavored with vanilla, cinnamon, or even a bit of citrus zest to elevate the dish's aroma and taste. The slow cooking process allows the rice to absorb the flavors and the milk to thicken into a rich, creamy texture. Rice pudding can be served either warm or chilled, making it a versatile option for different seasons and preferences. Its gentle, creamy texture and the mild, sweet flavor profile make it an excellent choice for a school dessert, offering a source of carbohydrate and calcium. New York is well known for its pastrami on rye sandwich that was popularized during the 70s as a popular deli lunch that was affordable. Soon enough, delis across New York served the sandwich at a cheap price, making workers grab the sandwich during their breaks. Corned beef and cabbage offers a cultural touchstone in school menus, particularly around St. Patrick's Day, providing a festive and educational meal. This dish involves slow cooking corned beef in a spiced brine until it is tender, then adding chunks of cabbage that cook until just tender, absorbing the rich flavors of the meat. Corned beef and cabbage is not only a nod to cultural heritage, but also a balanced meal, offering a good mix of protein and vitamins from the cabbage. In school settings, this dish serves as a special menu item that can educate students about international cuisine while providing a nutritious and flavorful meal. Its preparation, while requiring more time than some other dishes, is relatively straightforward and can be executed with basic kitchen equipment, making it feasible for special occasions in schools. Green chilies are an iconic part of New Mexico cuisine, so it is no surprise that the green chili cheeseburger was a go-to lunch for locals in the 70s. This was a fusion burger topped with a chili stew made out of green chilies and melted cheese on a patty. Though a heavy lunch, the tangy and spicy variation of cheeseburgers was just too tempting for people. Ballymaloe Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Ballymaloe stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too. That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Ballymaloe House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Bacon. The bison burger is definitely not something you will be snacking on. Montana's favorite lunch in the 70s and even today is a burger made using lean bison meat sourced directly from Montana. Runza was a famous sandwich in Nebraska during the 1970s, attaining the status of being an iconic lunch. Though the sandwich originated from Europe, it found a new home in Nebraska where people started referring to the sandwich as a regional dish. Powdered milk in school cafeterias serves as a practical alternative to fresh milk, particularly valued for its extended shelf life and lower cost. This dehydrated dairy product is reconstituted by adding water. Powdered milk is often used not only as a beverage, but also as an ingredient in various recipes, from baked goods to mashed potatoes, enhancing their calcium and protein content. Although it may lack some of the flavor nuances of fresh milk, it remains an important nutritional component, offering essential nutrients such as vitamins D and A. The use of powdered milk in schools is driven by logistical advantages. It requires no refrigeration and can be stored for long periods, making it ideal for large-scale food service operations where efficiency and cost-effectiveness are priorities. Its inclusion in school meal programs ensures that students receive sufficient daily dairy intake, supporting their overall health and development within the constraints of school budgets. Then you had Kraft and their boxed dried macaroni and powdered cheese mix. This was actually introduced all the way back in 1937 during the war period, but it was something that lasted all the way into the 2000s. Like I said, while all the dishes here are respectable in their own right, not one of them has this kind of a lifespan or impact. It's a comfort food like nothing else. It takes literally zero cooking skill to prepare, and it's something that almost every community and group in America can agree on. And trust me, that is rare. The South has its own style of mac and cheese. Gourmet restaurants do their own thing with it too, and the typical baked recipe has had 1,000 variations done on it at this point. Basically, there's a mac and cheese lying in wait for everyone. You just need to find it. That rounds up the most popular lunches from all the decades in the 20th century. Which lunch stood out to you? Comment down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.